Everyone, welcome back. Last time we were taking a look at the developments in Renaissance architecture and how Brunelleschi, after his defeat with the competition for the Florentine baptistry doors, went down to Rome and took his apprentice Donatello with him. And when they were in Rome, they were inspired by the classic Roman and Greek images that they came across. Brunelleschi, of course, was interested in Roman architecture, but Donatello was interested in the sculpture that he came across. And so what we're going to see is how these ideas of humanism, which we've been taking a look at, which are part of the late Middle Ages and really take root in the Renaissance, of going back to classical texts, starts to influence Renaissance art as well, where we see Renaissance artists going back to ancient Greek and Roman sculptures and art, architecture, and trying to recreate those ideals in their own contemporary world. And so we're going to see a big part of that in the art that we talk about today. I wanted to just kind of pick up a little bit where we left off last time. We talked about Ghiberti and how he, quote unquote, won the competition for the Florence cathedral doors, and for the next several years he worked on that. And you can see here that he too is inspired by classical architecture and classical images, as we see with his construction here. This is probably one of his most famous images that come from the baptistry doors. And on the left-hand side, you see the replica that's actually in place today in Florence, and then you see on the right-hand side his actual doors, just an image from that. But this is Jacob and Esau, and this comes from Genesis chapter 27, where Jacob has Isaac has two sons, Jacob and Esau, and one of them sells his birthright, right, due to not really living a quote-unquote righteous life. So what we see with Ghiberti representing here is more of the entire story, right? And so there's multiple moments over the story that are happening here. For instance, on the top right-hand side, you will see the angel announcing to Rebecca that she's going to have two sons and that they're going to have a future conflict. To the left down here, she gives birth. And then we see Jacob down here receiving his blessing. And then Esau is facing his father, and he's a hunter, so he has two dogs with him. And these four women on the right-hand side, I have no idea what they have to do with the actual image. Maybe you guys can do some external research. I haven't found out how they fit in there, other than they're just there to look graceful and to kind of balance the juxtaposition as part of the townspeople, I guess. But the people of Florence took particular, this story was particularly interesting to them because they believed that the Jacob and Esau conflict is now being replayed between Jewish and Christians, where the Jewish people are selling their birthright. And so this is kind of the Christian time to reign. And we're going to see that narrative going to be repeated in European history. Where Christians think that they now have the mantle and they are the quote-unquote chosen people. And in a lot of ways, they're going to use that for ill. And so something to be cautious of is this idea of, what is that idea of a chosen person mean? Does that mean that somehow you're better and can, completely, overlook and disregard another group of people? Or does that mean you have greater responsibility, right? And so generally in European history, they kind of take the former approach to that rather than the latter, which is unfortunate. But what we also see within this, not only do we see kind of the classical garb, the dress that we see with Isaac, but we also see the classical architecture, and so we can see that influence that's starting to really take root in the Renaissance, which really is going to make Florence stand head and shoulders above everyone else, because they're going to do something quite different. Let's take a look at Donatello, right? Donatello went down with Brunelleschi and was inspired and brought back classical ideals with him, and he wanted to recreate David. And As we go through this story, which comes from, I think it's 1 Samuel. Correct me if I'm wrong with that, but I think it comes from 1 Samuel. I wanted to read through this story and to see what elements that he chooses to emphasize and what elements of the story he chooses to kind of overlook, or, I mean, because you can't really stress everything, right? You kind of have to minimize some things and kind of marginalize other things, and that helps us to understand the argument of a particular artist. But the image of David is going to be particularly important for people of Florence because they're going to see themselves as David, right? Florentines see themselves as David, and Goliath is Rome. Goliath is always overshadowed. Florence has pretty much always been just kind of a small town, and still to this day, it's a fairly small town in Italy. But now they see themselves kind of rising above that and becoming the cultural and economic center of at least the European world. Let's read through the story and see what stands out. And I guess I do have the quote at the very bottom, 1 Samuel chapter 17. So I guess I was right about that one. And there went out a champion out of the camp of the Philistines named Goliath of Gath, whose height was 6 cubits and a span. And this is him saying, if he be able to fight with me and kill me, then will we be your servants. But if I prevail against him and kill him, then shall ye be our servants and serve us. And so this is kind of a winner-take-all kind of mindset. When Saul and Israel heard those words of the Philistine, they were dismayed and greatly afraid. Nobody wants to go against him. And David spake to the men that stood by him, saying, what shall be done to the man that killeth this Philistine and taketh away the reproach from Israel? For who is this uncircumcised Philistine that he should defy the armies of the living God? And David said to Saul, let no man's heart fail because of him. Thy servant will go and fight with this Philistine. And the Philistine came and drew near unto David, and the man that bare the shield went before him. And when the Philistine looked about and saw David, he disdained him, right? So this is what I want you to think about in terms of how does he look, right? For he was but a youth and ruddy and of fair countenance. And the Philistine said unto David, am I a dog, that thou comest to me with staves? And the Philistine cursed David by his gods. And the Philistine said to David, come to me, and I will give thy flesh unto the fowls of the air and to the beasts of the field. And then said David to the Philistine, thou comest to me with a sword and with a spear and with a shield. But I come to thee in the name of the Lord of hosts, the God of the armies of Israel, whom thou hast defied. This day will the Lord deliver thee into mine hands, and I will smite thee. And it came to pass that when the Philistine arose and came and drew nigh to meet David, that David hasted and ran toward the army to meet the Philistine, and put his hand in his bag, and took thence a stone, and slang it, and smote the Philistine in his forehead, that the stone sunk deep into his forehead, and he fell upon his face to the earth. So David prevailed over the Philistine with a sling and with a stone, and smote the Philistine, and slew him. But there was no sword in the hand of David. Therefore David ran and stood upon the Philistine, and took his sword, and drew out of his sheath thereof, and slew him, and cut off his head therewith. And when the Philistines saw their champion was dead, they fled. All right, with this, right, what is the story that Donatello is choosing to depict within his art, right? What commonalities do you notice? What liberties, right, artistic liberties, does he take, right? One thing that stands out to me is the idea of his youth, right? He's focusing on this is just a young boy here. I would guess that Donatello's David is maybe 12, maybe 13, but probably not. Maybe 11 or 12, somewhere in there. So it's really young, really small, right? We see the head of Goliath at the feet of David as he's kind of sunken down. We see him taking the sword of Goliath in his hands. We see the fact that that David is unarmed, right? He's armed only with his faith, right? And so Donatello chooses to emphasize that, right? Some of the liberties that he takes is I don't think David actually went out there nude. That's a stretch. but it's an indication of his faith, right? Which makes him seem even more vulnerable to be able to go out on the battlefield like this, completely bare to the world. Interestingly enough about this, when Donatello created this is the first life-size nude in modern history, right? And this is something that the ancients did, but it's not something that they would do during the Middle Ages. And so when people saw this image of Donatello's David, it was scandalous. Some thought it was pornography because it was, exposing everything. And so people were pretty offset by this. But what Donatello is emphasizing here, not only is it symbolic of his faith, but it's also paying tribute to what he saw in Rome. We see with the Praxiteles, the image here of him being completely exposed, or Apollo, right? This is how the Greeks and the Romans represented figures, because they wanted to emphasize the gods and the gods' creation, to celebrate humanity as an act of creation rather than as an act of shame. And so this is a different mindset of the medieval Christian mindset of that humanity is born into sin, that humanity is this wicked being that needs to cover up. This is suggesting that humanity is different, fundamentally different than what they saw humanity during the Middle Ages. And this is a photo that I took of the Borghese Gallery in Rome. The Borgheses were a very wealthy family in Rome. I mean, there was wealthy families throughout. We mainly been talking about the Medicis, which was a wealthy family in Florence, but they've been all over. Borgheses were another wealthy family. They like to collect a lot of art. And today they've turned their home into a museum. And you can see a lot of their Greek and Roman architecture that they've collected over the years in these two images. We can just see that it's completely adorned the entire lot. And as you take a look at these images, and if you ever go to Rome and you go through the museums, you can start to see how much the classics were so influential in this, pivotal time in the Renaissance, this Renaissance era that's starting to influence people. But noticing that a lot of the Greco-Roman art is unclothed, right? And the question is, why would we want to represent it that way, right? I think if a member of the church was to, create something like this for the church, I think we would consider that to be scandalous today. And so we have to consider, why is that, right? What are the values that we're emphasizing? What should be the values that we're emphasizing within that? And I'm not trying to pose anything. I'm just trying to pose ideas or thoughts rather than push an agenda. Thinking about this is a good juxtaposition between medieval art and Renaissance art, to see the clear juxtaposition between them, right? We're one with Madonna and Child. We've seen that before, Madonna enthroned, or Mary, right? Sometimes she's referred to Mary, sometimes she's referred to as the Madonna, right? That just means another name for Mary. But what we see is that the face doesn't really look right. The head doesn't necessarily look realistic, right? It seems as though it's more of a caricature than it actually is a human being. And during the medieval period, they felt that because things were spiritual, right? They're trying to represent the spiritual realm of something that's different from who we are today, that it shouldn't look like what we see today. And so it needs to be different than the actual world that we live in. The world that we live in is lowly in their minds. Therefore, we need to transcend that and do something that looks different. And every time we hear about something spiritual or heavenly in the scriptures, we always say that it's beyond description. And so it shouldn't look like something that we can actually see, right? It should be something a little bit different. So the focus of the medieval era is to be different than the physical realm. Well, what we see during the Renaissance is that's a different mindset. That it's not about, that the physical world is lowly and humanity is inherently corrupt per se. What we see during the Renaissance is that that God created the world, that God created humanity, that God created us in his image and put us at the center, as Mirandola says, of his creation to be able to understand and contemplate its beauty, so that the beauty can inspire us to be like him. And so the world that we live in isn't inherently corrupt, but it's actually inherently beautiful. And by mirroring those beauties, then we can become closer to God, right? So it's a different type of mindset. And so that's what we see with Donatello. This is me standing in front of Donatello's, David, in the Bargello, another wealthy family, in Florence. And so this one is in Florence. And I just want to show you this juxtaposition. This is an earlier rendition of Donatello's David, right? So it's the same story, but this is pre-going to Rome with Brunelleschi. What we see here is more of an emphasis on kind of that medieval style, right? And we see some elements of classical. If you kind of look at his face, he kind of looks like one of the ancient, Greek statues or something like that. But if you take a look at the body, the neck, take a look at the arms, right, and the elbow, it doesn't necessarily seem that lifelike. It seems a little too like he has made of rubber or something too. He bends too much, right? And then we have to see at the very bottom, right? We can see it's pretty graphic, the stone sunken inside Goliath's head. But it's just a little bit less realistic. And then this is me standing next to it. And actually, this one is about maybe 10 feet away from the actual famous one that Donatello did, which is this one. So these ones are actually in the same room, in the same gallery. And I think that's important because it shows the transformation. So what I want you to do as you take a look at these images is I want you to note the similarities, right? What's he telling within the story, but also what are the differences? And what do these differences emphasize? How do they, capture an essence of an era, right? Donatello is going to be the leading sculptor that shapes the Renaissance mindset. He's showing this idea of going back to the classics. He shows this humanism applied to the arts, right? And I just want to show you a couple of close-ups here. We can see a little bit better of Donatello's face, and this is me walking around in the Bargello, and just kind of give you a sense of the three-dimensional aspect, because it's a sculpture. It's meant to be in 3 dimensions. But you can see the complete emphasis on bone structure, on muscle structure, and trying to get that right, to make it look anatomical, to get it to look as realistic as possible, right? And then you can just see a close-up of, his face. And his face is kind of interesting because what we see here is it's almost as though after the victory, he's kind of retreated to his childlike innocence. He's kind of in a daydream, kind of looking off, not really realizing the success and what that actually means, that he's saved his people from slavery because he's such a small boy, right? Can a small boy really understand the magnitude of that situation, right? And then you see a close-up of his feet with the head of Goliath, this kind of victory. And then you can see the back image of it, and you can see the helmet of Goliath kind of caressing David's leg. And then you can see the stone in his hand in the back, right? This one's kind of an interesting one. This one Donatello does towards the later part of his life. And this one is Mary Magdalene. And this one is kind of an interesting idea that gets us to think about art historians and how art historians start to categorize things and how do we do this within the humanities. Because this looks unusual. It doesn't necessarily fit within the nice classicism of, grace and harmony that we see within his Donatello. This one looks a little bit more ugly, hideous, I guess. I don't know. It looks problematic. But what it shows is not all art fits neatly within a box, right? What we see here as we think about the differences between them is that there's that one shows classical harmony. The other one almost seems as though it's going kind of back to the Middle Ages. And so, but the important thing to note with this is it's not as though artists are trying to create things within a box and saying, well, I can only do Renaissance art, right? They're just creating things, right? And it's after the fact that we kind of come back and ascribe labels to them, right? The Renaissance images generally focus on balance and harmony, generally demonstrate ideals of beauty and simplicity. However, this work is of Mary Magdalene is not harmonious and it's not an ideal beauty, right? She's normally known for her ideal beauty, but this is an emaciated figure, right? Someone that's completely starving, right? Almost reminiscent of a hermit that just kind of lives away from society, lives away from the community, completely impoverished, doesn't really focus on her physical appearance. She's hungry here, she's destitute. Her long, unkept hair covers her body. It's a haunting image that seems to resist the typical Renaissance art, right? So it's peculiar. However, she does represent the ideals of loyalty. She does represent the ideals of devotion towards religion. She's an ideal representation of what someone should be who gives her life to God, right, in service. She longs for the divine and completely ignores the physical world. And so in a sense, that is kind of Neoplatonism, right? That's Plato's ideas, is that we should forsake the physical realm in our aspiration for the ideal or the eternal realm, right? So she's ignoring the physical world, focusing entirely on her spiritual world, even to her own detriment. And so anyway, this is kind of an interesting juxtaposition. This one's made from wood. This one's currently located in the basement of the Florence Cathedral, which has a museum there now. And this is one of the works that's down there. But anyway, it gets us to think about, we have to not oversimplify art as we go through it and think that everything has to fit within a certain criteria. All right, let me introduce the next artist by taking a look at Giorgio Vasari. Giorgio Vasari was an art historian, one of the first art historians. He was also an artist, but he was really enamored with a lot of the artists out there, and so he starts writing about the artists that were there and how inspired he was by them. And he's kind of like a groupie. He's an artist groupie. But what he shows is how important artists are becoming, right? They're becoming elevated rather than just kind of the medieval period. They were just craftsmen that they learned a trade and they were kind of like a carpenter making a chair or a table or something. Now we see artists as some type of genius, philosophers, almost quasi-prophets that have great insight into the human condition that we need to aspire to. And so his following of artists as a groupie shows how important artists were during this time because they were able to emulate God's creations, right, to get us closer, to inspire us. And so here's what he says about the following artists. While industrious and choice spirits, aided by the light afforded by Giotto, we've talked about him before, and his followers, right, so Giotto shows that trend towards the Renaissance, focusing on realism and depth within painting, strove to show the world the talent with which their happy stars and well-balanced humors had endowed them, and endeavored to attain the height of knowledge by imitating the greatness of nature in all things. So again, the idea for the artist is to imitate God's creation, right? Nature. The great ruler of heaven looked down and seeing these vain and fruitless efforts, right? So all these artists that were trying to emulate nature, trying to emulate God's creations, failed, even though they were trying, right? And presumptuous opinion of man, more removed from truth than light from darkness. And so all of these kind of, people as artists were kind of going around, scrambling around in the dark, trying to recreate God's creations, and they all failed, right? In order to rid him of these errors, to send to earth a genius universal in each art, to show single-handed the perfection of line and shadow, and should give relief to his paintings, show a sound judgment in his sculpture, and in architecture should render habitations convenient, safe, healthy, pleasant, well-proportioned, and enriched with various ornaments. He further endowed him with true moral philosophy and a sweet poetic spirit, so that the world should marvel at a singular eminence of his life and works, and all his actions seeming rather divine than earthly. So who is this artist that Vasari is celebrating? It's Michelangelo, right? We talked about Michelangelo before. As a young child, he did this image on the left-hand side at a young age of about 12 to 14. And we talked about how, as he was doing this, Lorenzo comes in and gives this critique, right? He's taking a look at the head of a faun, which is supposed to be, right? The faun here is not like I talked about not a baby deer, right? It's that mythical goat creature. It's generally supposed to be young, kind of like Pan, if you've ever seen images of Pan. Kind of this kind of young image that's going around, generally trying to be a little bit mischievous. But here Michelangelo represents him to be older, right? And so Lorenzo says, hey, shouldn't he have his teeth missing? So Michelangelo takes his chisel and knocks out the teeth and then smooths them down. And Lorenzo is so impressed by this that he decides to invite him in to his own kind of world. And so he has access to the humanism. He has access to Neoplatonism. So he's surrounded by all of these Renaissance ideas, and it starts to influence his work. And so he's influenced by classicism. Here we see Bacchus, who's the god of wine, who actually kind of has grapes around his hairline. And then he has these kind of, sorry, my mouse is freaking out here for some reason. It just wants to randomly jump in the presentation. But anyway, he's kind of showing his kind of tribute and drinking. His gifts to humanity is to give them alcohol so they can forget that they're mortal. It's kind of an old Greek mindset. We can talk about that later. And then we have Pan, who is kind of that mythical goat creature. We can see his youth. But what we see within this image, the main reason why I chose this one is it shows how important the classics were, right? So rather than just representing Christian images and saying that's the only thing that we can do, they're suggesting that there's some value that we can find, right? There's some other ideas that are out there that can influence us. Well, we talked about how when Lorenzo died, Savonarola, who is a radical monk, kind of takes power. He starts condemning everyone to death. France invades Italy, and he says that's a sign and that God is angry with us. The second coming is nigh. You all better repent. The last judgment's coming. And so it freaks people out. They started burning their art. And he exiled Lorenzo's two sons from Florence. And as a result, Michelangelo decides to leave to go to Rome, right? Rome is going to be the next major patron, the funder of art. And so he goes generally where the money is. But it's also going to heavily influence him. Savonarola's ideas of suggesting that him being surrounded by these pagan ideas constantly overshadows Michelangelo. And he constantly has a struggle with his own salvation, which we're going to take a look at. I want to take a look at this one, Pietà. Pietà means pity. It means mercy, right? This is the image, we've seen this a little bit before, Madonna enthroned, right? Generally shown with baby Jesus, but here Michelangelo focuses more on what's considered the lamentation. Lamentation is taking Christ off the cross and mourning the dead body. This is Mary holding her dead son in her arms, right? And I wanted to show you a couple close-ups of this to show you what Michelangelo does, right? What he's able to capture here. We see that the subtle halo, right? Generally, she's shown with a halo, but a halo is not necessarily realistic, right? We don't necessarily see people walking around with halos in the world. And so he just gives it so gentle and so subtle, right? We see her head cast down. And the look on her face is not of pain and suffering as we see with Giotto. Giotto's earlier image of the same kind of thing of Mary holding her dead son in her arms shows extreme pain and sorrow and suffering, right? What we see with Mary is a quiet reverence, a quiet acceptance, right? This inner strength, this inner fortitude of accepting what has had to transpire in order for salvation to come to pass. As we take a look at the face of Jesus, right? Jesus's face is a sense of relief. It's almost as though he has a smile on his face. This is after he's been brutalized, after he's had the weight of the world on his shoulders and bled from every pore, and then was hung on a cross in an excruciating manner. He now in death is released from suffering. And so here he's not representing this image that we would see with Grunwald. Grunwald is a German artist. We'll take a look at him when we take a look at the Northern Renaissance. But generally what we see with the image of the dead Christ is this idea of brutalization. We see with Grunwald the welts on his body, the cuts in his chest. We see the extreme thirst, right? The discoloration on his lips. We see the tiredness in his eyes and the long piercing thorns that are on his head, right? But Michelangelo was influenced by Plato. What we see within his image of the dying slave, which is an image that's in the Louvre, what we see is the slave is kind of breaking free from his earthly shackles, that the body is an imprisonment that contains pain, it contains suffering, but in death, we see the release. And so he's actually embracing death because in death he can be free. Free from pain, free from servitude, free from slavery. It is freedom to look towards the eternal realm. And we see that embodied within Michelangelo's Pieta in the face of Christ, right? Take a look at also what we see is that the extreme influence or attention to detail in the body. Take a look at the shoulder bone. Take a look at the neck. Take a look at the cheekbone, the forehead, how every curl is delicately placed there. And you have to remember that Michelangelo is doing this out of marble. He has to chisel this away. And then he has to smooth it with cloth because there is no sandpaper at the time. He has to smooth this with cloth, right? In order to make it have that shine. Wanted to show you a couple other images, right? So one thing to keep in mind is this sash that we have across Mary's torso here. And according to legend, what happened was that when Michelangelo did this, he became world renowned. He became renowned within Italy, right? That was kind of their entire world at the time. But he became this prominent. They said that this guy is the artist of artists. Well, according to legend, someone took credit for Michelangelo's Pieta. And so one night, I guess that's kind of how I imagine this happening at night, he comes in and across the sash of Mary, he writes Michelangelo Buonarroti. That's his last name. So you can kind of see Michelangelo here. And then Buonarroti, he's kind of writing this in Latin, did this, right? And in one way, right, this is his only signature that he's ever done on any of his works of art. And at the time, he felt that was a little bit boisterous. It was a little bit arrogant or prideful because before, remember, the artists in the Middle Ages didn't really take credit for their work, right? But here he's actually signing a work of art and taking credit for it. And so it was quite new. Now we kind of think of that as just kind of par for the course. But this was quite new for him to take credit for his art, to sign his work. And so he felt that was too arrogant. And so he never signed another work of art ever again. But in another way, I think that it also shows something else. It shows his mindset. In a world kind of plagued by Savonarola's extremism, he constantly felt responsible, right? Michelangelo Buonarroti did this, suggests his guilt for the sins that he has that he has made, right, in his life. And so in some ways, this is a way of him self-reflecting, but it's also a way for us to self-reflect, right, on what we have done, right? Taking a look at a couple of close-ups here, we can see that Mary pressing her arm into the torso of Jesus. And again, so you have to imagine that being in, this is in marble, right? We see the spear wound in his side. We see that his sunken abdomen with all of the breath now taken out of his body, his sunken chest, right? Giving us a sense of hyper-realism. We see the veins on his hands going up to his elbows, right? We see the nail prints in his hands and in his feet. Focusing on realism. Michelangelo was dissecting human cadavers in order to understand how the body works, to understand the creation. At the time, that was considered by the Catholic Church to be sacrilegious, and someone could be burned at the stake for doing that because it was believed that once someone dies, you leave their body alone and let them rest with God, right? But Michelangelo knew that in order to really understand, to create great works, to emulate God's creations, he needs to do this, right? And so, interestingly enough, when he is working for the Pope knew he was doing this, but the idea is plausible deniability. He would just give Michelangelo the key at night and say, lock up, don't tell me what you are doing, and I'm just going to go to bed, and you just keep creating your masterpieces, right? And so, but the idea is he wants to go back to that classical emphasis on that body in order to create as realistic as possible. Just to give you a sense of the kind of the history of the Pieta, it's in the Vatican in Rome, and it's in St. Peter's. And as you walk into St. Peter's, it's directly to your right. And in the 1970s, it's mainly kind of out in the open. They had this kind of shield in front of it, but someone that was just kind of off his rocker jumped over the little gate there with a rock hammer and started chipping away at the Pieta, which to me is a sin punishable by death. But anyway, he knocked off her nose. You can see that he hit the nose. He hit her hand. You can see her arm missing here. And he believed that he was Christ. He was shouting some type of weird kind of stuff, believing that the second coming was coming and that he was going to bring... I don't know why he decides to attack this beautiful image as a result. But they later did fix this. And so it has this kind of, difficult history, even though to me, it's one of my favorites. I know I shouldn't choose favorites, but one of my favorites in the Renaissance and one of my favorites in art history. And so... anyway, they've restored it. It looks fairly decent now, and now it's behind this kind of 6-inch bulletproof glass, and there's still the railing that's there, and so there's a railing, and then like 10 feet beyond that, you have the bulletproof glass, and so you can barely see it today because it's so far away. These are a couple images that I just wanted to show you Michelangelo's technique. These are actually in the Academy of Art, and they're right next to his David, which they moved into this room. But these are his quote-unquote unfinished works. And what you see here is what I love about these. And as the more I go to the Gallery of Art in Florence, the more I'm enamored by these, right? I love Michelangelo's David, but these are starting to pull my attention more and more because what you're seeing here is the mind of a master. You're seeing how he worked. And what he worked, rather than working from the top down, he worked from the front back. And what Michelangelo argued is that he was just releasing the image that was already in the stone. He was just freeing it from the confines of the stone. And so he was very selective on what stones he would use. He only chose from one specific quarry in Italy, and that's where he would get all of his stone from. He would know exactly how a piece of stone would chip, because if you hit something the wrong way and it chips too much, you've destroyed the entire image and you have to start all over again. And so he was very selective about that. This one's kind of interesting. If you guys are ever near Salt Lake City, they've actually done a life-size replica. A company came in and did computer measurements of the Pieta, and the Catholic Church allowed them to do that. And then they took that 3D rendering, and then they used lasers to cut into the stone. And they used the same stone that Michelangelo used. And they used the lasers and they cut into it to make it look pretty close. I mean, I think it looks almost exactly. There's a couple edges that look a little bit rough to me, but anyway. They put this, they donated this. I don't know why, of all places they donated this to. I think there's like 2 or 3 of them. I think there's one in South America as well. But they donated one to Salt Lake. I think it's the First United Methodist Church in Salt Lake has a life-size replica of the Pieta. And so I went down there to take a look at this, and you can get much closer. There's still a piece of glass. You can see the glass kind of shining in it, but you can at least get, within 6 inches of it and really take a look at the detail. You can see here, I mean, it looks pretty close. The only difference I would think is on the leg of Christ. You can see some of the marble coloring coming through. You can see some of the gray on his leg. But other than that, it's actually really cool. So if you're in Salt Lake, I highly recommend you stopping by. Generally, it's open. It's open, I think, Mondays through Thursdays, and then on Saturdays it's open. For some reason, I think it's closed on Fridays. I want to take a look at his David, and I want you to think about how this one is similar to or different from his Donatello's David. And what's interesting about this one is Michelangelo eventually does come back to Florence because the Medicis were reestablished and Savonarola was executed. We talked about that before. And so he eventually does come back to his home. He always kind of has this home center in Florence, is where he grew up. At the time, they wanted a statue to go on top of the Florence Cathedral. And so because the Florentines had this identity of David, right, believing that they were kind of the David, they said that this is what we want, right? And so Michelangelo says, hey, I want that commission. So he got the commission. But most people were advising him against it, right? And they said, you don't do this. Because Donatello is the standard, right? He's the one that created the David the David to end all Davids. And it's kind of like if you watch a really good movie, you like it, and then you hear that they're going to remake it, and you're like, no, you're going to ruin the movie. And so they warned Michelangelo not to do it, and Michelangelo said, not only am I going to do this, my David is going to surpass Donatello's David. And they all thought he was kind of crazy. They knew how good he was, but they didn't think he was that good. And so he goes, and interesting enough, he finds a piece of used marble that some other artist had abandoned because he thought that the marble was unworkable. And Michelangelo, as he was going through the quarry, he said, that's the one I want. On that piece, I'm going to create my masterpiece, right? And so kind of interesting. They haul it back to Florence, and he starts working on this. And it's a long, laborious process in order to create something out of stone, because in order to chip away and have it chip right, you actually have to stand under running water. And this is done during the 15th, early 16th centuries, when there is no indoor plumbing. It's not like you can just stand in the shower. So they actually have to create this system, and someone has to pour a bucket down, and then the bucket has to kind of go through kind of like a water or a flower pot or something that sprays down, that keeps the dust particles down. And so it's a painstaking process, and this is huge. I mean, this one is about 17 feet high. And one of the reasons why it's so big is it's going to go on top of the huge Florence Cathedral. And so it has to be that high for it to look life-size by looking at it from the ground level. But what's interesting about this is, we see the emphasis on this classical architecture, right? Classical sculpture. We've seen that before with Donatello. So he keeps the tradition of Donatello alive by representing the nude, right? This idea of faith going forward. And he's representing the ideal human form. But there's some differences that I want you to note, right? So what are some of the differences that we see? One thing that we see, and this is what Michelangelo was reading when he was taking a look at the story. He said, when he took a look at 1 Samuel chapter 17, he focused on these 3 verses. He says, and David said unto Saul, thy servant kept his sheep, and there came a lion and a bear, and took a lamb out of the flock. And I went out after him, and smote him, and delivered it out of his mouth. And when he arose against me, I caught him by his beard, and smote him, and slew him. Thy servant slew the lion and the bear, and this uncircumcised Philistine shall be as one of them, seeing he hath defied the armies of a living God. And so as he takes a look at that, right, the story of David, he says, is Donatello's version of David something that can slay both a bear and a lion? He says, probably not. And so he says he's going to represent an older version of David. He's going to represent the David of strength and masculinity and determination. And so there's also a couple other differences. I wanted to show you this is at the Academy of Art. And what's my favorite part about going to the Academy of Art is looking at the faces of students when they see this, because they learn about it in their classrooms. And we see it all the time. It's one of the most popular sculptures in Western culture. But seeing it is quite different, because I can tell you how big it is, but until you see it, it's hard to get a sense of it. And so to see students' faces when their mouths drop and they say, "Oh, well, that's what you mean by it's huge." Yeah, that's what we mean by it's huge. And so they've dedicated this entire gallery for this one work of art. And then on the sides, as I first walked in, you can kind of see as I'm walking in to these sides, you can see the unfinished images, the unfinished sculptures that I was talking about before. This image over here, this is me walking around to give you a 3-dimensional look. And I love the back part of the knee where it shows that tendon right there. Focusing on the attention to detail, you can see the abdomen here, you can see the pecs, you can see the bone structure of the rib cage, you can see the knees. The skin on the knees, you can see the hand, the knuckles, you can see the fingernails, you can see the triceps, the calf muscles, the quads, the butt muscles, the back muscles. I mean, he's left no stone unturned, so to speak. No pun intended. But again, he's doing this out of stone, and so it's quite impressive. This image here, right? This stick here is actually just something in order to help the weight, because stone is extremely heavy. And you couldn't have all of the weight of David on tiny little ankles. And so this is a way Michelangelo kind of tweaks it in order to get to kind of disguise or to hold the weight of the actual sculpture. And this is me and my wife standing next to it, again, just to give you a sense of size. And I know it's still hard to get a sense of it. Taking a look at the attention to detail, we can see the eye, the pupil within the eye. We can see even the furrowed brow, right? The skin as it kind of curls up as he looks out onto the battlefield. We can see the hand, and inside the hand is a stone, and so he actually has to carve out each digit, each finger, and then he has to carve out as though there's a stone inside each one. But also the moment that he represents is quite different. The moment that he chooses to represent is the moment before the battle, where Donatello is focusing on the moment after the battle, where victory is complete. This is him not really, having that victory, but his facial features, right? As he looks out onto the battlefield, we know that his determination, his faith is going to win it, right? So we can see that look of determination on him. But again, it's not this kind of warrior face where he's just kind of has this extreme look. It's this inner strength, this inner kind of dignity, similar to what we see with his Mary, right? As she has this inner strength as she's, dealing with suffering. Different kind of Goliaths that both of them are facing, different challenges that they're facing. As I mentioned before, initially, it was supposed to go on the Florence Cathedral, which would be a religious message, right? Which would be, this is a religious idea, and this is, idea of faith and devotion. But when they saw it completed, they said, "Wow, that is amazing. We can't put that on top of a church. We're going to put it in front of Town Hall." So we're going to put it at the Palazzo del Vecchio, which you see here. This is the Florence Town Hall, and it's still there to this day. And this is, again, I talked about where this is where Savonarola was burned, and the Medicis had, an office building there. And initially they put it here, and now they put a replica. And then in 1817, they decided, we need to get Michelangelo's David out of the weather, and they did this long, painstaking process where they put it on they created this entire train that had tracks that would go about 1 mile per hour. It was extremely slow as it goes through to its current location. And so it was a very laborious process. In the process, interestingly enough, they actually cracked one of the elbows of David, which I would hate to be that guy, right? To ruin a national treasure. They eventually glued it back together and they pieced it, and so it looks great now. But then they put it in its current home, its current location. And then again, this is just again to give you a sense of perspective. That's no one I know. I just found that online. I don't know who that guy is, but as they restore it over the years, and you can see his sling that's on his back as he looks forward. Just to kind of to end our discussion, just briefly here, I wanted to show you this image. This is the Pope, the tomb of Pope Julius II, who was the Pope that really was enamored by Michelangelo. I wanted to start here because this is actually going to lead into our next discussion on painting. But Pope Julius II commissioned him to do a tomb for him. And this was quite common. People wanted tombs to commemorate their life and so that they can be remembered in death. And so he commissions Michelangelo to create this, which is going to be a long, painstaking process over several years. And here's where Julius II is going to, his remains, right? So this is kind of the tomb here, or the coffin. They're going to put his body in here, and then they're going to seal it. And then there's going to be this, big kind of grandiose element here, where you have the Mary and baby Jesus here, Madonna and Child, Pope Julius. Then you see Leah, who's symbolic of the life of good works, and then Rachel, who's symbolic of the contemplative life, and then Moses. And Moses is the lawgiver, and Julius II saw himself as the lawgiver. And so I just wanted to show a couple images here of Michelangelo's Moses, and you can see the extreme emphasis on detail. The horns here are due to a mistranslation. The mistranslation was when Moses came down from Mount Sinai, he had something protruding from his head. So they interpreted that to be horns, but really it was, the light of seeing seeing God transfigured him into a different state. So he had this light that was beaming from him. Michelangelo knew that at the time. They knew the mistranslation, but because it was a common motif to signify Moses, so people would look at this and say, obviously that's Moses. He kept true to that tradition. But as Moses is kind of turning here, he has two tablets in his hand, the commandments, and he turns and he looks. And what happens here is he is distracted by Israel. And so you have to think about, what is Israel doing? Israel is, as Moses has gone to talk with God, Israel is making a golden calf. And so how quickly humanity forgets and turns to vices. And so so Moses here is kind of distracted by the sins of his people as he's communicating with God. And interestingly enough, as Michelangelo was working on this piece, the St. Peter's Basilica started to sink, and they built it in a swampland. They built it in a marsh, and so it wasn't necessarily the best place to build. But the reason why they built it there is that was where St. Peter, the one that Christ gave his keys to, right? So Apostle Peter was killed. And so they built it on that, showing that the foundation, right? They put the foundation of Peter, or the church, St. Peter's Basilica, on that very spot. And so it's that sacred spot. And so they put it there. It's believed that Peter is buried somewhere below St. Peter's. And so that was starting to sink. And so the Pope was distracted with that. And Michelangelo was running out of money. He needed more money to create more of these images and to get more of the more stone. And so he started using his own money, and finally he went to Julius and said, I need more money. Julius wouldn't see him because he's so busy with this new plan of rebuilding St. Peter's Basilica, which Michelangelo will have part of, but that's kind of a later part of the story. And Michelangelo goes to see him on Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, and Julius doesn't see him. And then finally on Friday, Michelangelo says, if St. Julius wants me, if Pope Julius wants me, if I can get that right, Pope Julius wants me, tell him I've gone back to Florence. He goes back to his studio in Rome, destroys everything in it so no one can steal his ideas, and goes back to Florence, and he leaves Rome. And so what we're going to see, kind of the next part of the story, is Pope Julius saying, hey, where did Michelangelo go? And so there's a kind of an interesting story that I kind of wanted to leave off there, just kind of as a teaser for our later discussion as we take a look at art.